Hello there, and welcome to Cool Talk and the History of the World. Today we'll be discussing the Native Americans of North America. In previous videos, we looked at the Mayan civilizations, the Incas, the Aztecs. We briefly looked at the Olmecs, Toltecs, and also other minor civilizations of South America. Now, we also discussed the migrations into the Americas and how they spread across the present-day Alaska all the way to the southernmost tip of Argentina. There were over 500 tribes or nations in the Americas. Most of the history is gone. Now, depending on where they lived, the natives wore loincloths, or in colder weather, deerskin, moccasins. If they lived by the Arctic, lots and lots of fur. The Inuits would make clothing from caribou skin, and they would have fur on the inside and fur on the outside. They would even have a parka to carry babies in. They would make goggles out of carved wood. Native Americans would wear a ceremonial mask, war masks, sometimes feathered hats that they would have to be earned. They were stamps of honor. Now, Native Americans would use pictographs, and I like this one down here. It means wise. They had no written language, so they would resort to cave drawings and oral history that was told by both men and women. And they also used, in Massachusetts in the East Woodlands, the wampum belt. These designs would communicate messages, tell history, or be used for currency. They fished with underwater cages, nets, and barbed harpoons. They lived in wooden homes, plank houses, hogans, longhouses, chickees, teepees, wigwams, earth lodges, and the famous igloo up north. They traveled by using dugout canoes, bark canoes, kayaks, bullboats. They used snowshoes and toboggans. The natives would trade fur with the Europeans. They would trade for cloth, beads, guns, alcohol, utensils. There were many benefits. It was very lucrative, but it caused the white settlers to encroach more and more on their land. When they traded for guns, which was very good to fight hostile tribes, but it also increased warfare. And a big negative was trading for alcohol. For some reason, Native Americans' DNA makes them very susceptible to alcoholism, a problem that is still prevalent today. One of the biggest contributions to the world were the many types of food that was unknown to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Avocados, corn, pecans, plums, potatoes, squash, sunflowers, tomatoes, walnuts, and then, of course, chocolate, vanilla, and tobacco. Tobacco has no benefits except for a few people that are making a lot of money. In the U.S. alone, 480,000 people die each year from cigarette smoking. That's almost one person per minute. And of those people, 41,000 will die from secondhand smoke exposure. That's 1,300 deaths per day. Worldwide, 7 million people die each year. That's one person for every 4 seconds. Now, much of the knowledge that we have of the Americas come from the writings of European explorers and settlers. Unfortunately, about 90% of natives died from diseases such as smallpox, influenza, and dysentery. The oral history is mostly gone or not recorded, ignored, or lost in all the years of warfare. Now, John Cabot left England in the services of King Henry VII. He landed between Maine and Newfoundland and claimed the land for England on June 24, 1497. He returned to England and claimed that he had found the mainland of Asia. Ponce de Leon from Spain reached Florida. He tried to colonize Florida with very little success. He encountered the Timucua Indians, a tribal nation that would disappear entirely in 300 years. Jacques Cartier from France explored Canada and the Great Lakes area, and he thought that the St. Lawrence River would take him to China. He encountered the Mi'kmaq tribe, traded for pelts, and also met the Iroquois. Now, his biggest success was establishing a French presence in the Americas. Others would follow. From Spain, Hernando de Soto would travel through, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Missouri, Arkansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. He really got around. In 1671, Simon d'Aumont de Saint-Lusson claimed the lands west and south of the Great Lakes for France, while 14 tribal representatives stood by and watched. Afterwards, 2 missionaries were sent out to explore the area: Father Jacques Marquette, who wanted to Christianize the natives, and Father Louis Joliet, who wanted to discover some more trade routes. To their credit, we learned a lot from these explorations and their writings, but also no killings and no thievery took place. King Louis XIV of France sent a nobleman, René Robert Cavalier Sieur de la Salle, who explored and claimed the entire Mississippi River basin for France. Now, de la Salle named the land after King Louis XIV, Louisiana. Now look at this map and you'll see the huge number of tribal nations that existed at the time. Unfortunately, most of their history is gone through warfare, the fact that they had no writings, and their oral history consisted mostly of creation and their origins. Now, after the ancient natives known as the Anasazi surged, their successors were the ancient Puebloans. Now, Puebloans were known for their structured society and fabrics made from plant fiber, but they were more famous because of their apartment buildings. There were 9 major building complexes in Pueblo Bonito. They were 5 stories high, had 600 rooms, roads that were 100 miles long, irrigation systems, stairways that were carved into cliffs. The Puebloans would spread to southeast Utah, northeast Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado, but they would peak in 700 AD, way before the explorers would reach them. Now, the Hohokans and the Mogollons of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas had many canals, 500 miles of canals that would allow them to grow crops all year long. They traded with Mexico, they had class societies, but for some unknown reason, they died out, possibly because of corrupt leaders or maybe raids from other tribes. One day, a native woman by the name of Jigan Sasi and 2 men, Dekanawida and Hiawatha, were instrumental in creating what would become the Iroquois Confederacy. 5 nation tribes: Mohawks, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. And they even had governments with separation of powers, checks and balances, democratic principles, much like the government we have in the U.S. today. There were 8 major cultures: the Arctic and Subarctic, which was the Aleut, the Inuit, and Yupik. In the East Woodlands, there were hunter-gatherers from the East Atlantic, from Virginia to South Labrador, big on shaman, religious practices, spirits, and medicines. The Southeast area consisted mostly of farmers, fishermen, and hunters. There were the Plains Native Americans, and the word tells you itself that they lived on the plains. There was a Southwest area with mystical adobe homes and hunters. And look at all the different kinds of desert animals. There was a Great Basin area, which was for hunters and gatherers. There was a Pacific Northwest, which is mostly rainforest, deer, and elk, and California, which was very, very diverse. And the Native Americans in California were very big on tattoos. There were 5 nations that were called the civilized nations: Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. They actually tried to mesh with the Europeans, and they also got raided by other tribes. The Choctaws would be pushed over to Oklahoma. They lost 32 million acres of land. During World War I, Choctaw natives were used as code talkers. Now, the Cherokee, which spread out over Tennessee, Kentucky, North and South Carolina, and Georgia, were pushed with the Indian Removal Act in 1830. They were moved west of the Mississippi. They had to walk 1,000 miles in what was later called the Trail of Tears. Of over 15,000 Cherokee, 4,000 died of hunger and exposure. The Chickasaw were from Mississippi, Alabama, West Kentucky, and Tennessee. When the Civil War began, they sided with the Confederacy, but when the Confederacy lost, they lost more land than they had before, and they lost any slaves that they might have owned. More on the slavery issue later. The Creek Nation was actually a confederation of many tribes from Alabama, Florida, Georgia, and Tennessee. They sided with Britain during the American Revolution, mainly because they wanted to protect their fur trade. But when the Americans won, they negotiated a treaty with the American nation. They ceded some land and they were sent over to West Georgia. But there was war, incursions, and resistance. And there was also civil war among themselves. Their leader, Tecumseh, went with them and they attacked in 1813 Fort Mims in the Battle of Burnt Corn. They killed 500 Americans, but then General Andrew Jackson led an American army with some Cherokees against them and defeated them at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, and the Creeks were pushed into Oklahoma. In 1819, Spain sold Florida to the United States. A treaty was signed and the Seminoles were given an area in central Florida. But they were in the Relocation Act, they were told in 1830 they had to go to Oklahoma. The Seminoles refused, and so began the long Seminole Wars. There were actually 3 Seminole Wars in all. General Andrew Jackson led the war against the natives again. By this point, the Native Americans had a name for Andrew Jackson. They called him Indian Killer. Now, in one of the wars, Chief Osceola of the Seminoles was captured. He died of malaria in a military fort. In the Third War, the Americans were exhausted, but so were the Seminoles. And by 1858, the Seminoles were offered money and a passage to Oklahoma, and they left. But some of them stayed behind. They hid in the Everglades and Okeechobee. When the last U.S. troops left, they came out of the swamplands and remained in central Florida. Other nations had their own stories. The Navajos of the 1800s would raid other tribes. Then a scout by the name of Kit Carson burned their crops, forced them out of hiding, and they were marched to a resettlement camp. During World War II, the Navajo natives would serve as code talkers. Now, the Tlingit nations of Alaska, if you look at these pictures, they look very different from what we see with Native Americans. Their first contact with the Europeans was from the Russians in 1700s. The Russians came over to set up trade and fishing centers. There was a war, they fought back, but they lost. In 1867, the Russians would sell Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million. The United States bought this in order to keep the Russians from expanding into the Americas. But then gold was discovered, and a little bit later on, there were oil drillings taking place. In 1959, Alaska would become a state. And today, almost a quarter of Alaska's population is made up of Native Americans. Now, in the middle of this sad, abusive, and tragic story, we have to look at some of the ugliness of history. The fact that some, not all, Native Americans actually owned black slaves. By this point, many white colonists looked at Native Americans as noble savages, but they continued to look at the black Africans as beasts. And many natives that wanted to ingratiate themselves with the white lifestyle and look at themselves as good, smart businessmen began to purchase slaves. Cherokee Chief John Ross owned 15,000 acres of Mississippi land and 400 slaves. But not all natives fed into this. Keep in mind, there were many alliances between African and Native Americans. There were intermarriages. We have Black Cherokee today. And comparing one Native American to another, say a Seminole to a Creek, is like comparing a German to a Frenchman or a Bolivian to a Puerto Rican. You get all sorts of different kinds of cultures and all sorts of different kinds of people. Let's discuss some of these natives. One native chief by the name of Powhatan, he expanded a confederacy of 30 tribes from Washington, D.C. to North Carolina. In 1607, the Pilgrims arrived and made a settlement called Jamestown. Now, the natives did not trust these white men. They captured the captain, John Smith, and it may or may not be true that Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, may have interceded on his behalf. It could be just a legend, but at any rate, Pocahontas would marry John Rolfe, and they would move to England, where she would be baptized a Christian, renamed Rebecca Rolfe, have a son, and died at the age of 23. In 1620, some pilgrims arrived on the Mayflower. They arrived in Massachusetts. There were about 120 settlers. Now, water was scarce, food was scarce, the winter was very, very harsh, and 50 of them died. And from the Wampanoag tribe came Chief Massasoit. He decided that these white people needed help. So Massasoit sent a native named Squanto over to help. Now, Squanto was from the Patuxet tribe. He had been kidnapped by the British, made a slave, and escaped. But bottom line was that he knew the language. He taught the settlers how to hunt, how to fish, and how to build appropriate housing. When the weather warmed up, the 52 remaining settlers and the natives made a treaty, and they celebrated a 3-day feast known as the First Thanksgiving. An Indian chief by the name of Pontiac, yes, just like the car, from Ottawa, he helped the French fight the British in the French and Indian War. He helped defeat General Braddock. He attacked 13 British forts, and 8 of them fell. But in the end, the French had to surrender. A Native American girl by the name of Sacagawea from the Hidasta tribe was kidnapped at 9 years old. She was sold at 13 to a French trapper who ended up marrying her. Now, when President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana area from the French, he hired 2 explorers, Lewis and Clark, to look at the land. And they went along with Sacagawea and her husband, who would help guide them. Now, Sacagawea was pregnant at the time, which is why a lot of these pictures and drawings will show her carrying her baby. She died at the age of 24. Now, Chief Seattle from the Suquamish tribe rallied the natives against the British, but then he got baptized a Catholic, but he would continue to fight peacefully for Indian rights. Apache Chief Cochise fought the white settlers for over 10 years. When he passed away, young Geronimo would take over. Now, Geronimo's family, his wife, his mother, his children were killed by white settlers, and he fought the white men for 30 years, finally surrendering in 1886. He lived from that point on in military facilities. Then he became a farmer. He appeared in the 1904 World's Fair and was in Theodore Roosevelt's inauguration. Chief Sitting Bull of the Hangpapa Native tribe and Chief Crazy Horse of the Lakota tribe helped defeat General George Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But unfortunately, these battles and wars would continue. Then there was the massacre at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of Native American men, women, and children were massacred. Now, Crazy Horse would be the first one to surrender years later. He was defeated because, well, frankly, his people were starving. He was imprisoned in Fort Robinson. When he heard that his wife was sick, he left the fort without permission to get his wife to her parents' house. He returned to the fort, was arrested, and bayoneted in the stomach. He died. As for Sitting Bull, he ended up surrendering in 1881 for the same reasons. He was imprisoned, but he was let go and he participated in the Buffalo Bills Wild West show. However, he felt so humiliated with the whites that he quit. He died in an altercation in 1890 in his cabin. There was an order for his arrest, some warriors resisted, and in the confusion, he was shot. Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce tribe was a baptized Christian. He signed a peace treaty with the United States in 1873. But when 4 years later he was told to relocate, well, he led 700 people across 1,000 miles to evade U.S. military capture. Unfortunately, he was cornered in Montana. In October of 1877, he surrendered. He went to a reservation. He died of heart failure, and some say he died of a broken heart at the age of 64. Let's talk about how the United States dealt with the Native Americans. At first, there were treaties all the way up to the year 1830, but these treaties were often unfair or they were rescinded. Then came the Indian Removal Act of 1830, basically pushing the natives away and giving the white Americans 25 million acres of land for farming, cotton, and slavery. From 1850 to 1871, reservations were allowed to the natives with the condition they convert to Christianity. Then in 1871 came assimilation. The government decided to civilize the natives by taking away their children. away from the family to be educated in boarding schools. Parents could visit once or twice a year, and these little children were not allowed to practice their customs or their native languages. In 1928 came reorganization, conserving and developing the land and the resources, extending native rights, and providing vocational education. But by 1943, when the U.S. government saw that the Indian lands had uranium, oil, and coal and natural gases, well, President Truman didn't want Indian rights to get in the way. So in 1943, the termination policy was put in place to dismantle the tribes. They would be considered just Americans. There were no Native Americans, and they would have to act as such. And finally, the Self-Determination Act of 1968, where Native Americans were allowed certain territories where they had Indian autonomy. They were given money, and they would decide how they would use it. There have been many famous Native Americans. We'll start with Will Rogers, a humorist. He was Cherokee. He made 71 films. He wrote 4,000 newspaper columns. Now, we've had many Native American congressmen, but on January 3rd, 2019, for the first time, 2 Native American women joined the U.S. Congress, Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids. Native Americans have served in every American war, and the famous photograph taken in World War II at the Battle of Iwo Jima, Ira Hayes was one of those holding the flag. And in the first Gulf War, Lori Piestewa became the first Native American woman to die in combat. And that's it. And for my next video, we'll be discussing the Celts. But in the meantime, tell me what you think. Comment below, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk. Thanks for watching.